tonight. And it's been really neat. So I want to ask you a question. Are you a trusting person? You know, how do you know who you can trust? Do you trust God? Can you trust God at every stage of your life? Just some stuff to think about tonight while we're doing this. My verse for tonight was from Luke 23, 44 to 47. And it's the sixth saying up on the cross. It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. So you know that was dark. For the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." When I was given this verse, I talked to Ruth last week too. The first thing that came to my mind was the word trust. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. God and Jesus had this plan from the beginning, but Jesus was in a really vulnerable spot right there. He was going to go through a lot of stuff, and he was going through a lot of stuff, and he trusted, and he took that choice right at that moment to trust God. Trust is the basis of emotional health. Would you agree with me? I work with a lot of young parents, and we've realized that trust is an emotional milestone that a small one has to accomplish in order to be emotionally healthy later. If they're looked after physically, of course, you know, sleeping and feeding and changing, and if they're emotionally cared for by emotionally available parents, then later they can be healthy. And they can be healthy on up into their 80s. They can have good relationships with others, and they can have faith in God if they have that initial trust. And it's really important. And so a lot of my work has been around trust. So in this way, I also wanted to think that trust is such a basis for our spiritual growth, isn't it? Trust is so important to us. And we need to know that we can trust Jesus for what he's done. So let's just talk about tonight. What has he done? Jesus brought us in a new covenant. And I've really had fun studying this and looking at it this week. In the old days, he had a covenant with Abraham that he would bring faith to the whole world through Abraham. That was his covenant. And, you know, we have lots of favorite heroes and our Psalms, and we read a Psalm tonight, thanks Dave. And there's so many pieces of the Old Testament that we absolutely love. And those were the covenants of the Old Testament. But a lot of the dealings that people had were with the law. It was like, if I will, you will. So if I would obey the law, then I would be blessed. If I didn't obey the law, then I would be punished, right? Would you say that from the Old Testament? That was kind of how it worked out. And God had a covenant, and he loved his people. And he was preparing them to bring the gospel to the world. But as we've come into the new covenant, sort of by mistake, I think we've kind of brought that idea into our covenant with Jesus now. Because sometimes we have that feeling that we have to do a whole bunch of things. We know that Jesus saved us, but if we do something good, God will bless us. If we do something bad, God won't bless us. And we kind of have, by mistake, put that in on, and it's an Old Testament covenant, and we put it into what we have now. And the Old Testament covenant covered sin, and it didn't change a heart. So it was lots of laws, lots of things to follow. And it paid for last year's sins, but it didn't change anybody's heart. But when Jesus came and brought the new covenant, it absolves us of sin. It makes us as if we never sinned. He comes and lives in our heart. It changes us on the inside. Makes us want to do what we want, what he wants us to do. It's a totally different change. Like it's from within. It's a totally different thing. And when Jesus died, he was giving us that new covenant. It's interesting that Matthew and Mark and actually in also Paul later said that when Jesus did the Passover that day, he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So this is a new covenant, totally new. God put a bow on the old. He said, all those people before were waiting for me to come. And he put a bow and he said, "It is finished." This is a new covenant. Isn't that exciting? Amen. This is a new covenant. So first, I want to talk to you about what is a covenant. How many have your phones with you? Phones? Okay. When you bought your phone, what did you have to sign? A contract. Thank you. You signed a contract, right? All those people in there, they look like they would love to give you everything, right? And they'd love to look after you, but they want you to sign a contract and pay. And lots of money. That's right. And so you sign this and you say, you know, every month I will pay. What happens if you don't pay? You break the contract, right? So that's what a contract is. And a contract is an agreement between, a legal type agreement between two people. A covenant is different. A covenant is a one-sided promise that a person has made to keep his side of the promise. And Jesus has done that. He has offered us salvation if we want it. And he promises to keep that promise. And he doesn't need us to sign the other half of the paper and pay every month. Does that make sense? So that's the new covenant. And with this covenant, we can reject it, but he will always offer it. And so to join into this covenant, we need to come to him and we need to confess our sin. And most of us, I think, here probably have done that and let Jesus forgive it. But I sometimes look at things through other people's eyes, and sometimes I've tried to say that to somebody, and I kind of get that, like, especially from younger kids, it's kind of like, well, I don't actually know if I've sinned. Like, I don't really, like, some of us have a list as long as our arm of things we need to say we're sorry for, right? But sometimes people look at you and they go, like, I don't really know what I've done that I have to say sorry for. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so I found this verse, and so I really studied on it. And in John 16, it says, Jesus says, the Holy Spirit will convict people of their sin because they didn't believe on me. And you know, the only sin that we have to say sorry for is that we didn't believe on him. Isn't that cool? That's the sin that we need to be sorry for. We do all kinds of other things when we're not following him, but if that's the sin that he died for, is because a lot of times we stand with our back to him, right? And you know the idea. How many of you have ever looked after a toddler and like if you draw a little line right there and you say, don't put your toe over that, what do you think is going to happen? What are you going to do, you know? Right? And that's just like the bent that we have inside us. We don't mean to do that, but that's kind of the bent that we have. That we put our toe over the line to see what will happen. And but the idea is that is in us, and confessing our sin is when we turn our face toward Jesus. And we say, ask for his forgiveness and say we're sorry and we want to believe on him. And it's just, that's how we join into that covenant. And it's just really exciting. And from that moment, he promises to be with us with his presence. And he promises to change everything from the inside out. And we don't have to try so hard to keep all the rules, right? In fact, in John 5, some people came and asked him, what do we have to do what God requires? And the people that were asking this were used to the I will if you will, right? They were saying, like, what kind of stuff do we have to do what God requires? Do you want to hear what this simple answer was? He said, the work of God is this, to believe on the one he has sent. That's Jesus. That's the work of God, is to believe. Do you find that freeing? Mm-hmm. That's the work of God. So we turn our faces toward him, and he gives us his presence in our lives. And then he says, okay, so you filled the first commandment. Remember, he had love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So he says, you filled the first commandment. And he said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Here's my commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. It's very interesting. Actually, in the scriptures, it says, keep my commandments, plural. And then right in the same sentence, it says, this is my commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. And I found that so freeing also. That is his commandment. That's the thing he wants us to do. We don't have hundreds of rules to follow like they did before. There was one simple rule. Love one another as I have loved you. And it sounds so simple, but it's so hard, right? It could be, right? It could be so hard, but it is so freeing. And, but I sat and thought about that, and I thought, how much simpler would the world be if that one commandment was followed? Just dream on that for a minute. If we loved others sacrificially the way Jesus loved us, nobody would ever steal. I wouldn't steal from anybody. Of course, I wouldn't kill anybody. I wouldn't hurt the reputation with gossip. I wouldn't, I would never, if I love and honor a spouse or a future spouse, I'd never step out on them. Just let your mind wander, like for a minute, what kind of things wouldn't happen if we loved each other? It's a big thought. Yeah, no wars. There we go, thank you. Yeah. And can you see just how different this new covenant is from before? The old way was not doing things because those were the law, right? And if you followed the law, God will bless you. Jesus' new covenant is he has blessed us. He wants to bless us. And the only thing that he asks is that we love one another. Hey parents, don't you love it when your kids get along and they play nice together? I wonder how God feels when we play nice with each other. Eh? It's a thing to think about. It's just kind of a fun idea as a parent, right? That God probably just his heart is just probably as happy as could be with our services even. Like we're all just together, right? And we're the church, right? So that's awesome. So I want to read John 15. Jesus says, if you obey my command, you will remain in my love. Notice he didn't say you'll earn my love. Remember, it's one-sided promise, and we don't have to earn the love. You'll remain in his love. And my command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. And again he says, this is my command, love each other. So I said at the beginning that we can trust Jesus and what he's done for us. He's given us a new covenant and a new commandment to love. Can we trust him? Does faith work in the trenches? This is a subject that I've been thinking about for quite a while now, and it's been a real subject of thought for me. How can we trust God and serve him through all the stages of our life? It's something I've thought long and hard about. The Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. He'll straighten them, right? But how can we trust God at every stage? When we're kids, teens, new parents, empty nesters, new retirees, next stage heaven, right? Have you ever heard of the default setting? Going back to our phones. Okay, grab your phones again. If you have a cell phone, how many of you ever play with the settings? Do any of you play with your settings on your phone? What kind of stuff do you adjust? Color? Yeah. What else? Somebody else give me. What else do you adjust on the settings in your phone?
Wi-Fi.
Yeah, Wi-Fi. Always. Yes. Sound. Yeah.
Notifications.
Yeah. So we have a whole list. We do the apps and we do all of the. We put all kinds of stuff in our pics and our notes and all that kind of thing. We put them all in, right? But what happens when you get an update? Does it ever happen to anybody but me?
Your phone shuts off and restarts.
It shuts off and restarts and comes back in what mode?
Default,
right? It does, doesn't it? Eh? It's actually really. I have an update. It's been telling me for 3 days, and I'm scared to do it because then I'll have to go back and fix everything. But it gets a default setting, and I've been thinking a lot about the default settings of life because sometimes we get an update. We move to the next stage of our life. Like from a teen who's really loved Jesus and then becomes a young adult. Or when a person suddenly becomes a new parent. Or like I said, a person retires and a next stage heaven. We get to that next stage and sometimes we just don't have a model. And we can land up in default setting. Following me? Mm-hmm. And we don't really mean to, and we love God just as much as we always loved him, but sometimes we don't act the way we wanted to. My example of that is when my mom passed away when I was 8, and I went to live for a time with an auntie who loved me, I think. I don't know. And she was pretty rough. And I don't mind telling you that. I mean, I think she did it out of love, but she didn't know how to do it. And it was really rough. And I learned how to be grounded, and I actually never grounded my children for that reason, because it was a horrible situation. Not abuse, I wouldn't say. I think she loved me, but it was a horrible situation for me. But what I found, how I discovered this default setting before we even had cell phones, was when my kids hit that age that I had been, I ran out of a model, and for a little while, I started treating them the way my aunt had treated me instead of the way my mother had treated me. And my mother had been just such a lovely, caring, creative, amazing person. And just for I think for about a year actually, I kind of turned into my aunt's way of doing it because it was default, and I didn't love God any less. I just didn't realize that my whole behavior had changed. And I remember sitting down as a mom and going, that's not who I want to be. I'm not doing that. And I had to find a new model. So I hit default and I needed to find a new model. I'm sure you've all seen this, I've seen people leave a relationship for no real reason at the same time that their parents left when they were kids. And I've seen an older neighbor become really crabby just because all of the older people they had known were crabby. Seriously, we talked it through. That's the negative side. And I've seen positive. I've seen people who have pushed past a family trigger point and made it. But the trigger points, sometimes it can be something bad that happened in your family, or sometimes it can just be an age change, or it'll be that next step. So can I just encourage you, as you go to each next step in your life, invite Jesus to rewrite any negative script. Stay tucked into Jesus' covenant and love others all over again. Do it well, hey? And when the settings on your phone get screwed up, do you yell and throw your phone out?
Some people do.
Sometimes. Throw it overboard for the boat, right? Oops. But why don't you? Why don't you throw your phone out?
It's expensive to buy new one.
It's expensive. It's worth keeping. Right? And you know what? When you fall into default mode, you're worth keeping.
Amen.
You're worth keeping. So don't throw up your hands and give it up. Just sit down and reset the settings.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds simple, doesn't it? But it takes a bit of thought. Okay, I want to love and serve Jesus. Check. Put it in the settings, right? I've decided that I want to love my family. Check. I've decided that I want to act kindly and love others. Check. I want to act with justice. Check, right? What are my core values? Love, mercy, justice. What are your core values? Think about that. And you can go check, and you put them back into your settings for that stage of your life. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just such a simple thing to think about. Next time your settings get all messed up, you can think of me, right? So back to trust. Jesus was willing to trust the plan that they made. And we're really glad he was, right? And can we trust in Jesus? I put a whole piece in here, and I'm just going to go ahead with it because there's a thought that I was just thinking about, that there's so much talk this day about people ditching their faith. And if anybody here is thinking of that, I just want to say, please don't do it. If you deconstruct anything, do something else. Just don't ditch the faith. Because if your church needs work, dig in there and help it. If your community needs to be changed, dig in there and help it. Work on something else, but don't ever give up the faith. There's so many loud voices right now, and so many experts in the field. Do you want to know my definition of an expert?
An X is a has-been and a perk is a wannabe.
There you go. That one's good. And I always, when I'm teaching, I say an X is an unknown quantity, and a spurt is any drip under pressure. And there's a lot of experts around. And I'm not dissing the real experts, right? But there are a lot of people that have such loud voices. And I just want to say, remember that Jesus put the bow on that stuff that came before. All those people were waiting for him. And there's nothing in the Old Testament that they're fighting about now, whether there was creation, whether there was Noah's Ark, whether there was Wall of Jericho, whether the scrolls, or nothing in there that they're all fighting about, whether it's real or not real, and we can believe what we like and they can believe what they like. There's nothing in there that's worth giving up your faith for. Not a thing. Jesus put a bow on it right here. He said that was all part of what God's plan was, and now this is a new covenant. So here we are. It's not worth it. Like, don't get mixed up on that, right? Just because there's a few experts, right? And Jesus said to his disciples one day, he said, "Will you leave me also?" And they said, "Where else would we go? You have the words of life." And then Peter said, "There's no other name under heaven by which people can be saved." Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." And just to be clear, Jesus is actually the only one who ever said that. I know that some of you have heard me say that before, but actually, in many other worship situations, they were just people looking for the way, and they got deified after they passed away, right? So Jesus is actually the only one that ever said he was the only way to God. And we have a live God, folks, right?
Amen.
We have a live God. And he doesn't sit on somebody's mantle or out in somebody's yard. He's live. One of my very favorite First Nations stories I read a long time ago was a young woman whose God had been the water. And her family's God was the water. That was who they worshiped. But when the pastor taught her about the story that Jesus actually stilled the waves and the wind, she said, "Oh, okay, he's bigger than my God." And she served him, and she served him for a long time. I wish I could remember the name of the book. It will probably come back to me, but that really spoke to my heart. And in this day and age, everybody is looking for spirituality. Everybody's looking for spirituality, right? And we actually have what people want, but they just don't know it exists. And it's just so powerful when you think about it. Everyone's searching for spirituality, and in Jesus we have the real thing. We have God's Spirit inside us. That's what people actually want. They want to have an experience. And it's real. Wow, it's real. When you really feel God's presence, you are hooked for life. Wouldn't you say that? When you felt God's presence. And when we were kids, one of my family members was having a really hard time. And I prayed for them. And I was just a kid too. I remember just reaching out my hand and praying, right? But God is real. You know, years later, that family member took a circuitous route and landed up in shelters and sleeping in a van. But you know what they said brought them back? They remembered that day when we prayed, they felt God's presence. We have it. That's what we have. We actually have a live God, and we have spirituality. So we can trust in God, right? We can trust in Him. God pays good rent. When we give our lives to Him, He lives inside us and He walks alongside us. So just to wrap up, because of Easter, it's a new covenant. So this is such a special time of year. It's a new covenant. All of our old ways of trying to earn God's pleasure, and it's just gone. It's wrapped up in a bow, and feeling like we should sing more worship songs or do more good things, and then God would bless us more. Jesus says all we need to do is believe, and His Holy Spirit will live in us and help us to love one another. Pretty simple, hey? So Jesus' new covenant at Easter is amazing, and it's time to put all our eggs into one basket, the Easter basket.